Oh, it doesn't. Okay, so we're going to start about 12 lines from the bottom of Mem Hey Amud Bet. Today's daf is Mem Vav, where it says Amar le Rav Yosef, Abaye le Rav Yosef. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, Vad lo tizpad Rabbi Yochanan ki Rabbi Yehuda. Don't you agree that Rabbi Yochanan follows the principle of Rabbi Yehuda? In other words, the previous discussion had ended with somewhat of a doubt as to what the position of Rabbi Yochanan was in terms of the halacha of Mukteh. Does he follow Rabbi Yehuda or does he follow Rabbi Shimon? He says you should have known already that he follows Rabbi Yehuda because Rabbi Abba and Rabbi Asi Igla'u lebei Rabbi Abba dimin Chayfa. Rabbi Abba and Rabbi Asi were once at the house of Rabbi Abba from Chayfa. Unefal min narta al glimei the Rav Asi, and a menorah fell. A candelabra fell on the, obviously not a lit one, onto the garment of Rav Asi. Velo tiltila, and he would not move it. My tama, what's the reason? Now doesn't that prove that, what was the reason he didn't want to move the candelabra? Because he holds like his teacher is Rabbi Yochanan, and his teacher Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rabbi Yehuda, that you can't move a candelabra on Shabbat. Now Rabbi Shimon would say, unless it's lit right now, you're allowed to move it. Rabbi Yehuda is the one that says you can't.
There seems to be a confusion as to which Rabbi Yehuda they're talking about here, whether it's Rabbi Yehuda and Asi, because later they talk about Rabbi Yehuda and Asi because they call him Rabbi.
No,
but here there is confusion as to whether that's the same Rabbi Yehuda or not.
No, Rabbi Yehuda and Asi and Rabbi Yehuda are not the same.
So we know
Rabbi Yehuda is a totally different person.
Completely.
Yeah, for sure. Because he's called Rabbi, he's not called Rabbi Yehuda.
Sometimes they call Rabbi.
Only Rabbi Yehuda Nasi or Rabbi, but they would never call him Rabbi Yehuda.
I see. Okay, so we know for sure it's different. Okay.
It's a different guy. Amar le said to him, Minarta ka'amrat Minarta sheneit Amar Rabbi Achab Rabbi Chanina Bar Chanina Amar Rabbi Asi Hora Reish Lakish B'tzidon Menorah nitelet biyado achad mutar l'taltala b'shtei yadav asur l'taltala. That a menorah, a candelabra, is different. You can't conclude that we hold like Rabbi Yehuda just because they wouldn't handle a menorah on Shabbat. Because it could be that menorah follows a different halacha. Because it was reported, Rav Acha Bar Chanina said that Rabbi Asi said that Reish Lakish ruled in Sidon that a menorah that you can pick up with one hand, you can move it. But if it takes two hands to move it, you can't. This is according to obviously Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't let you move any menorah on Shabbat. Okay, so this is following Rabbi Shimon. And you see that even though he's following Rabbi Shimon, he still doesn't let you carry a really heavy menorah. We're going to see a reason for this in a second. Rabbi Yochanan says, Anu en lanu ela b'nei Rabbi Shimon, aval menorah ben nitla b'yado achad ben nitla b'shtei yadav asur l'taltala. So Rabbi Yochanan goes even further and he says, actually, when it comes to a candle that's already been used but wasn't lit on this Shabbat, in other words, it's disgusting from the oil that absorbed into the earthenware, but it wasn't lit on this Shabbat, that's where we follow Rabbi Shimon. In other words, we generally follow Rabbi Yehuda bat Mukteh. Rabbi Yochanan is saying, generally. There's one case where we don't follow Rabbi Yehuda, which is Mukteh mechamat mi'us, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, something which is distasteful or disgusting can't be moved. And we disagree with that. We follow Rabbi Shimon. We say if there's an old item, an old candle, let's say, that was already used, but you want to use it as a cup for your soda, that's no problem. We don't follow Rabbi Shimon and say disgusting things are mukteh. But in every other respect, we follow Rabbi Yehuda. And whether you can carry this candelabra with one hand or it requires two hands, you can't move it on Shabbat.
That's what we learned, that it's subjective.
Okay, so let's see what he says. So now he says...
The one hand and two hand, that's the idea of shinui, or what's the story?
No, we're going to see why in a second. What's the reason? Because since a person something that's so heavy that it takes two hands to move it, a person sets a place for it. It's not moved around very often if it's that heavy. And if it's not moved around that often, it becomes almost like a part of the house. It's not a kli, it's not a vessel anymore that's moved around, but it's like a fixture. Because you're not going to be moving that candelabra around if it's so heavy that it takes two hands to move it. And that's the reason. Amar le Abaye Rav Yosef, Abaye said to Rav Yosef, V'harei kilat chatanim dadam kovei lo makom v'amar Shmuel mishum Rabbi Chaya kilat chatanim. We move to Vav Amud Aleph. Mutal l'ntota u'mutal l'porka b'Shabbat. So what did he raises an objection. He says, wait a second. According to that principle, anything that has a fixed place is considered like a fixture, and therefore you can't move it. And you're trying to explain Resh Lakish. We're not explaining Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rabbi Yehuda, that you can't move any candelabra on Shabbat. But according to Rabbi, you're saying, even according to Rabbi Shimon, if it's very heavy, you can't move it. Why? Because it's a fixture, it has a fixed place. Well, what about kilat chatanim? Kilat chatanim was something that went over the bed. You would have like two posts, one at the foot of the bed, one at the head of the bed, and a pole, a horizontal pole in between them, and you would hang a sort of a drapery that went down over the bed of the chatan. Very romantic. Okay? Now, this would stay in place, obviously, and yet it says you could put it together on Shabbat, and you can take it apart on Shabbat, even though it's something that normally stays in place. So according to your principle that something that normally stays in place is not capable, you're not allowed to move it on Shabbat. So why is it that you can move? Why is it that you're telling me you can move kilat chatanim? You can handle the bed cover of the chatan, but you can't move the menorah. What's the reason? So he answers him, Ela amar Abaye b'shol chuliyot. We're not, the reason why you can't move the candelabra is not because it has a fixed place. Not everything that has a fixed place can't be moved on Shabbat. Rather, we're talking about a menorah that's made of chuliyot. It's made of multiple parts. And putting it together, obviously, you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Okay? Because it's something that's put together and is kept that way. But since it's made of parts, one could break it apart as well. In order to move it, I guess, I don't know why you would. But the concern is, Rashi says, maybe it's going to fall on the ground, break, and then you're going to put it back together. Normally, you wouldn't take it apart, I guess, in normal use. Okay? But it could break. So, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish tisharei. So why then is Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish saying that you're allowed to move the candelabra that's held with one hand? What's the difference if it's held with one hand or two hands? He says, "My chuliot ke'en chuliot de'itba chidke." He says that what we're talking about here is a candelabra that looks like it's made of parts, but isn't actually made of parts. Now, how is this going to work? So he says, "Hilkach chuliot ben gedola ben ketana asura letaltala gedola nami de'itba chidke gezera atu gedola dechuliot ki pelige bektana de'itba chidke mar savar gazrinan umar savar lo gazrinan." So in the end, we can't actually conclude either way. We can explain both Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish as following Rabbi Shimon, and they have a different concern about this candelabra. What's the different concern? If you have a large or small, any candelabra that's made of pieces, we're worried that if you move it, it's going to break and you're going to put it back together. That's building on Shabbat. So we won't let you move it. If a large one looks like it's made of parts, in other words, it has grooves and different, it's shaped and formed in a way that looks like it might have been made of parts. So you also can't move it because you'll mistake that for one that's actually made of parts. But what about a small one? Small ones are generally not made of parts. So even if it looks like it's made of parts, you might say, I don't need to be so strict. I'm already being strict and saying that if the small menorah was made of parts, I won't move it, even though that's a rare case. But now I'm going to be so strict as to say that if a small menorah looks like it was made of parts, I'm going to make a gezerah that I might handle a menorah that is actually made of parts. But a small menorah being made out of parts to begin with is a rarity. So that's the machloket. According to Rabbi Yochanan, we're going to be consistent and say, in all cases, just like you're not allowed to move a menorah that is made of parts, you're also not allowed to move a menorah that is actually, just like you're not allowed to move one that's actually made of parts, you're not allowed to move one that it looks like it's made of parts. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is saying, when it comes to one that's actually made out of parts, I agree you can't move it. When it's a large one that looks like it's made out of parts, I also say you can't move it because it's so common to have one that is made out of parts when they're large that I'm worried. But a small one that only looks like it's made out of parts, There I'm going to be lenient. That's the machlok. Yeah, it's a gzera l'gzera for sure. Okay, so now Umi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hachi, did Rabbi Yochanan really say this? Vam Rabbi Yochanan said halacha kistam mishnah. So the point here is that Rabbi Yochanan came along and said he held like Rabbi Yehuda. And the question was, didn't we already know that Rabbi Yochanan held like Rabbi Yehuda because of the case of the candelabra? What was the answer? No, because there we could explain the case of the candelabra as being about something else. So we couldn't definitively say that he held like Rabbi Yehuda. That's why we needed him to tell us he held like Rabbi Yehuda. But now, doesn't Rabbi Yochanan say halacha kistam mishnah? That whenever there's an anonymous mishnah, we assume it's definitive. And it's not, and it says muchnish ela b'zman she'i nishmetet en chibur la v'en nimdedet ima v'en matzelet ima ba'o el hamet v'en goren ota b'shabbat b'zman she'yesh aleha ma'ot. We learned this braita, or actually this mishnah, on Friday. This is talking about the wagon. The wagon has wheels. Okay, the wheels, when they are separable from the body of the wagon, are treated like a separate entity. And therefore, any measurement of the wagon that would be relevant to the laws of Tumah and Tahora, we don't include the wheel. Any function that it has in terms of Tumah and Tahora, like if something tameh touched the wheel, it wouldn't affect the wagon itself. If the wagon is exempt from being mikabel Tumah, that doesn't mean that the wheel is exempt, because it's separable from the wagon. If the wagon is over an area that has a dead body buried, it might protect what's inside the wagon. But if something's hanging over the edge of the wagon over the wheel is not going to protect it, because the wheel isn't considered an extension of the wagon. The wheel is just another small area that has its own separate identity and is not sufficient to prevent the tum'ah from rising up and affecting the object that's hanging over.
Wagon.
No, it's underneath. It's underneath, buried under the ground. In the wagon, then
the whole thing is no?
It's a totally different story. It would depend on the size of the wagon and whether there's a covering over the wagon. But the point that they're making here, we did this Mishnah already on Friday, but the point that they're making here is that we had this rule that if there's money on the wheel, you can't roll it. Right? So bezman sheyesh aleha ma'ot, ha'en aleha ma'ot sharyav afalgav dehavu alei ben hashemashot. That means that even though there was money on the wheel before Shabbat, if it fell off on Shabbat, you can move it, because it says the only time you can't move the wheel is if right now there's money on the wheel. If it fell off before Shabbat, if it fell off on Shabbat, it would be okay. Who's that following? Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda would say if there was money on the wheel before Shabbat, you can't move it now. So what do we see here? A Mishnah that's supporting Rabbi Shimon. So how can Rabbi Yochanan disagree? Amar Rabbi Zera te Mishnatenu shelo hayu alei ma'ot kol ben hashemashot shelo lishbor dvarav shel Rabbi Yochanan. In order to preserve Rabbi Yochanan, we're going to have to give an answer that's a forced answer. And we're going to have to say that case in the Mishnah is talking about where there was no money on that wheel even from before Shabbat. Okay? We would read it simply as saying, if the money fell off even on Shabbat itself, you could now move the wheel. But in order to make Rabbi Yochanan consistent, we're going to have to assume that when it says there was no money on the wheel, it means even from before Shabbat. Because Rabbi Yochanan has to be able to reconcile this with the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, Pam achat halach Rabbi l'Diospera. Once Rabbi went to Diospera, v'horah b'menorah Rabbi Shimon baner, and he ruled about the menorah like Rabbi Shimon with the candle. What does that mean? We don't know. So, by the way, they asked a question. Horaba menorah Rabbi Shimon baner lehetera. Do you mean that just like Rabbi Shimon allows you to move a candle once it's extinguished, so too Rabbi had a lenient view that you could move a menorah on Shabbat, meaning one that hasn't been used. Okay, that's one possibility of what it means here.
What do you mean by diaspora? The diaspora?
No, it's a place.
It's a place.
Yeah. So Rashi explains here. Chadahor ahavai. Does it mean that there was one ruling? Okay. V'achi kamar, and this is what it meant. Hora b'menorah lehetera kederech sheyeh Rabbi Shimon matir baner yashan. That he meant just like Rabbi Shimon is lenient about an old candle, that we don't care about the fact that it's become disgusting from being used and you're allowed to move it, so too a menorah is allowed to be moved on Shabbat, even though it looks like it's made of parts. Okay? Like we said before, this was a machloket. Odilma hora b'menorah le'isura u'ki Rabbi Shimon baner lehetera. Or is it two different things? he ruled about the menorah that you can't move it, and he ruled about Rabbi Shimon that you could move a candle that was an old candle, in other words, an old dish that was used as a candle, an earthenware dish, that had absorbed oil and would normally be considered disgusting, as Rashi explains the second side. In other words, is it when it gave that report, was it saying that he gave one psak, he gave one decision, and the decision was leniency regarding moving the menorah that looks like it was made of parts? Or is it telling you two things? Stringency about the case of the candelabra, but leniency about the case of the old candle, that we're not concerned about the fact that it's become distasteful for use. Teku, they could not resolve the question. Rav Malkiah ikla lebe Rabbi Simlai. Rav Malkiah came to the house of Rabbi Simlai v'til tel sharaga v'ikbid Rabbi Simlai. He moved the candle that had gone out on Shabbat, it would seem. Okay, that's what how Rashi interprets it. The candle was lit before Shabbat. Shabbat morning, Reb Malkiah was moving it around. Who was he following? Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Simlai didn't like that. Rabbi Yosi Glila Rabbi Yosi B'Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Yosi Glila went to the place of Rabbi Yosi B'Rabbi Chanina till Shiraga. Again, he was moving the candle around. Ve'ikpad Rabbi Yosi B'Rabbi Chanina, and Rabbi Yosi B'Rabbi Chanina was upset. In other words, Rabbi Yosi B'Rabbi Chanina was following the law, the principle of Rabbi Yehuda. He didn't like somebody coming to his place and following Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Abahu ki ikla la'atred Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi hava mitatil sharaga. When Rabbi Abahu was at the place of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, he would move the candle that was extinguished on Shabbat. But ki ikla la'atred Rabbi Yochanan lo hava mitatil sharaga. But when he came to Rabbi Yochanan's place, he didn't do it. So the question, of course, is man afshach ik Rabbi Yehuda svir alei le'ebed ki Rabbi Yehuda ik Rabbi Shimon svir alei le'ebed ki Rabbi Shimon. So he's how can he do both? In one case he's following Rabbi Shimon, in one case he's following Rabbi Yehuda. Answer le'olam ki Rabbi Shimon svir alei mishum kvodat Rabbi Yochanan u'delo hava aved. That the answer is that he really held like Rabbi Shimon. He was really lenient. But when he was in Rabbi Yochanan's place, he wasn't going to disrespect him. Okay, he followed the stringency because that was what the accepted practice was in the place of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda said, "Sharagad de mashcha shoel letaltula." That if you have a candle of oil, okay, we're following Rabbi Shimon here, and it went out, you can move it. But din nafta asur letaltula. Now remember, neft or nafta is a very foul-smelling oil. So it's something, maybe, yeah. So even after it's already out, it stunk so badly you wouldn't want to use it for anything. Even Rabbi Shimon would agree it's unusable. There's no use for it. Rabav Rav Yosef Damar Tarva with the nafta nabishar letaltulei. Actually, Rabba and Rav Yosef disagreed. They said you could move it. Rav Avya ikla lebe Rava. Here's the funny story. Rav Avya came to the house of Rava. His feet were dirty betina with clay. He was walking in the dirty outside, in the mud. And then, he put his feet up on the bed. That's not nice. Rav Avya had dirty feet, he put them right up on the bed, and Rava was angry. And Rava was insulted, so he wanted to bother Rav Avya by asking him questions he couldn't answer. That was how they would get back at each other back then. So Amarle said to him, "My ta'ama Rabbav Rav Yosef Tamir Tarvayu Shagad Nafta Namishar Taltulei." Why is it that Rabba and Rav Yosef said that you can move even a candle of neft, even a smelly, unusable candle on Shabbat? Amarle said to him, because even though you wouldn't want to use that for anything, you wouldn't want to use the receptacle for anything because it's disgusting and it smells bad, still you could cover something with it. Let's say there's a hole that needs to be plugged up or covered. You could cover it with that. So that would be okay. Ela me'ata, if that's true, Rava said, then kol tzrorot shebechatzer metaltalin hoil v'chazel chasuye bahumana. So can you go out in the yard and take any rocks, since any rock would be able to cover a hole? If there's a hole in something that needs to be covered, you could use a rock for that. So can you take any rock from outside? He said to him, no, because that over there, when it comes to the rocks, they're not a kli, they're not a vessel. And everybody agrees that in order to be handled, it has to at least be a kli. Okay?
And please defined by something that has...
A human purpose, right? A human being has fashioned it. A stone that's just outside.
It can be used for human purpose.
Yeah, but if it's designated for human purpose, yes.
It have some sort of...
Not necessarily. No, it just has to be fashioned for human purpose or designated for human purpose. So he says, it's not. So therefore you can't move it even according to Rabbi Shimon. It's called etzim va'avanim. Etzim va'avanim, everybody agrees. If it's not a kli at all, if it's not an instrument of human activity at all, it can't be moved. Here, though, nobody's going to say that the candle that you burned kerosene in is not a kli. It's a kli. So you're allowed to move it. Milotani, did we not learn in the Braita? That when it comes to bracelets and nose rings and rings, they're like any other kelim that can be moved around in the courtyard. Now we're going to learn later in the Masekhet that many of these things were not allowed to be worn on Shabbat. Nowadays we don't really follow this. Nobody follows it. But according to the Talmud, women weren't allowed to wear certain jewelry, certain types of jewelry, etc. We're going to learn men weren't allowed to because they were afraid they would take it off and show it to their friends. They would, other problems. They would carry it on Shabbat. So, nonetheless, you could handle it if you needed to. So it was considered muktzeh. Those ornaments that you weren't allowed to wear were considered muktzeh because you're not allowed to wear them. But let's say you needed it for something, to cover a vessel, or for some other purpose. So now it's called tzarich ligufo. Anything muktzeh that you need on Shabbat, letzorech gufo, you're allowed to move it. If there's some purpose that now, you need a hammer. A hammer is usually muktzeh, but you need to open a coconut or something. So you get a hammer. All right? Something like that. So, if you need to. Scissors, normally you can't use.
Coconut, cracker, or whatever.
You can't use a pencil on Shabbat, a pen. Let's say you need to break open a package and you don't have anything sharp. So you use it.
No, to break open.
Right. Well, certain things you can. Certain things you can. You have to get food out of the package. Yeah. Food. So v'amar ula what ula say? Matam oil v'katorat keli aleha hachinami oil v'katorat keli aleh. Since it has torat keli, since it is a vessel, even though these certain types of jewelry are not allowed to be worn on Shabbat, and therefore they should be muktzeh. But since they are a keli, they're still considered a vessel. They're a human implement. Therefore, they can be handled if necessary. And so too here, this candle that you burned kerosene in, true, it's stinky and smelly, but it's not the same as moving rocks on Shabbat. Because rocks don't have any human purpose assigned to them. This at least has a human purpose assigned to it. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, Barich Rachmana delo kasifei Rava leRav Avya. Thank God, blessed is Hashem, who did not allow Rava to embarrass Rav Avya. Because Rava wanted to, get him because he dirtied his bed, but he didn't manage to do it. Ramele Abaye Abaye raised the following contradiction to Rabbah. Tanya, it says in the Braita, it says that the leftover oil in the cup after the candle has burnt out, according to the Tanakh Kama, is not allowed to be used. According to Rabbi Shimon, is allowed to be used. Alma le Rabbi Shimon le muktzeh. That would seem to imply that Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold by muktzeh, which is what we always say. But we raise an objection. Rabbi Shimon Omer Kol Shein Mumon Nikar Me'erev Yom Tov Ein Zeh Min HaMuchan. He says with regard to Yom Tov, that let's say you had a bechor, you had a firstborn animal. A firstborn animal has to be brought as a korban. What happens if the firstborn animal develops a mum? It develops a blemish. Now it can be slaughtered without being brought as a korban, of course. Now let's say on Erev Yom Tov, there was no mum. And now on Yom Tov, it develops a mum. Okay? So on Erev Yom Tov, you didn't notice the mum, it wasn't apparent, and now it is. So now you want to slaughter this as your Yom Tov lunch. You're allowed to slaughter on Yom Tov for food. Okay? So can you do it? He says, no, it's not min hamuchan. Since before Yom Tov, it looked like a perfectly good korban. You weren't gonna eat this bechor. Now on Yom Tov, the bechor develops a blemish, and it's usable. It's accessible to you now. But the problem is that before Yom Tov, you assumed it was a korban. Rabbi Shimon is saying that. So that's a problem, right? Because why does he care what you thought before Yom Tov? Right. It doesn't make sense.
Rabbi Shimon is stringent.
That's right.
Right.
So what's going on?
If you set aside for Shabbat, if something disqualified become pasuk, can you?
It would be the same kind of case, I guess. Yeah. So hachiyashta. So Rabbah said there's no comparison here. Hatam Adam Yoshev because remember, when it comes to a candle, the person is waiting for it to go out. Because even Rabbi Shimon would agree, if you lit the candle and it was a huge amount of oil that was supposed to go for 3 days, it would be muktzeh too, even if it went out. So when it comes to a regular candle, though, you're expecting it to go out. You're anticipating it going out. So you never fully removed your mind from using the candle. However, when it comes to a muhum, does a person sit and wait for a blemish to appear in his animal? It's not. In other words, a candle naturally goes out, is the point.
He may hope.
He might hope, but he's not yoshevo mitzapeh. In other words, it's not something that he assumes will happen. Meimar amar, right? So he says to himself, Mi yemar denafil be'muma. Who says that there's going to be a mum? Ve'im timtzal lomar denafil be'muma, mi yemar denafil be'mum kavua. And who's going to, even if it does develop a blemish, maybe it won't be what's called a mum kavua. If it has only a temporary blemish, it's not enough, because you have to wait for it to go away. Who knows if it's going to be a permanent blemish? And if you're going to say that then you need a chacham to come and permit it. You need an outside observer to permit it, a chacham. So there are too many ifs, there are too many what ifs. For a candle to go out, a candle goes out.
If it's temporary, it's still fit to be a korban?
Well, you would have to wait for the temporary to go away.
Once it goes away,
yeah, then you use it again. Yeah. So basically, it's too remote. The person's not expecting it. So if on Erev Yom Tov this was a perfectly good korban, there's no reason that the person has excluded it from their mind. Okay. So now, Mativ Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama raised another objection. Mefirim nedarim b'Shabbat, v'nishalim nedarim she'en letzorach haShabbat, that you're allowed to do hafarat and hatarat nedarim on Shabbat. What does that mean? Hafarat nedarim is a wife who says it makes a neder on Friday. So the husband has the power within a day to cancel the neder of the wife, right? Within a day he has to do it. So if she made a neder, or if so the husband can cancel it on Shabbat. If he heard about it, the day that he hears about it, he can cancel it, right? Or if you made a neder, you can do hatarat nedarim on Shabbat if it's necessary. Let's say you made a neder, you'll never eat tafina again, and then they have the best tafina and you didn't know. Okay, you can go out do hatarat nedarim. So the question is, but wait a second. How does the white woman know that her husband's going to cancel the neder? She shouldn't assume that. And therefore, let's say she made a neder, I'm not going to eat apples. Okay, I'm just making up a random thing. So now the husband comes and says, no, I cancel your neder. So eat an apple. But how can I eat an apple? When I made this neder before Shabbat, I was assuming all apples are prohibited to me. That's it. Prohibited to me. So now they're coming back. It's the same as the korban. Erev Yom Tov, it was a bechor. It was fully good. There was no reason to suspect it wouldn't be good. So you were excluding it from your mind. Now it makes a comeback because it has a mum. So even Rabbi Shimon says it's no good. So similarly, the woman made a neder, I'm not going to eat apples. That means every apple that she sees is no good. Now the husband comes on Shabbat and says, no, you can eat apples. I cancel it. How can it make a comeback? So the answer is, Hatam keder Rav Pinchas mishmei de Rava. Rav Pinchas answered this in the name of Rava. Damar Rav Pinchas mishmei de Rava kol hanoderet al dat ba'ala hi noderet. He didn't say this in connection with this case, but he said a general principle, that because a wife knows that her nidarim are subject to the approval or the cancellation of her husband, she never takes them as absolute. So even though she made a neder, she knew when her husband heard about it, he would be able to decide to cancel it. And that's why. So that's why it doesn't take effect. She knew that the apples might become permitted to her at some point on Shabbat because he might cancel it.
But she can be quiet about it.
She could be quiet, but then whenever he finds out, the day he hears, B'yom Shom'o.
Oh, okay.
B'yom Shom'o. This is the Torah says. Yeah, the Torah says B'yom Shom'o.
Okay, so if, in the case of the korban, let's say it develops a mum,
right.
But then they realized in Shabbat that he actually, that whereas they thought that it was a korban, fit for korban before Shabbat, they realized that the mum developed actually before Shabbat.
Right, if they saw it before Shabbat, so they knew they might have a chance to get out of it, Yom Tov it has to be, Yom Tov before Yom Tov. So then, but if they didn't even see it before Yom Tov, then in their mind, it was out of their mind.
No, but if somebody
That's what he says.
comes in, like they're sure that the korban is fit to be a korban before Yom Tov, and then on Yom Tov they discover there is one, but then somebody else comes and says, no.
It doesn't matter when it developed. It matters when they noticed it.
Okay, so it's
Because it's the mind.
Okay, so
Yeah,
it
it's
is
the mind. Yeah.
Right.
How about if it goes over 1 year? That's not 1 year.
Right. That would be another type of invalidation. Right. So Tashma, come in here. Why can you ask? Okay, we understand that a woman's neder, okay, is always subject to approval, the wife. But what about a regular hatarat nidarim? Why can you do regular hatarat nidarim? When you make a neder, you're not thinking, oh, the bet din is going to approve it or validate it. So how can you do hatarat nidarim? Why won't you say to yourself, maybe there will be no chacham, or in our case a bet din, to cancel it? Really, an individual chacham who's an expert is allowed to cancel nidarim, but we don't usually do that. We don't do that today. Okay, so the point is, hatam ilom izdakek lechacham sagile begimel hedyotot. Over there, when it comes to nidarim, even if you can't find one chacham to cancel your neder, you can get 3 regular guys, like we normally do hatarat nidarim with regular guys, and you can always find them. But when it comes to a blemish in a korban, it has to be a chacham. So when it comes to nidarim, even when you make the neder, you know that, hey, if I wanted to, I could find 3 regular Joes off the street. They could do hatarat nidarim for me. So I never, in my mind, totally exclude the possibility of enjoying whatever I made a neder against. But when it comes to a mu'min, an animal, it only can be released from its status as a bechor with a chacham coming to permit it, who has a special smicha for hatarat bechorot. Okay? And since he doesn't have that, since there's no reason to think he's going to find that person, therefore he really puts it out of his mind. Rami le Abai Rav Yosef. Rabbi raised an objection to Rav Yosef again. Mi amar Rabbi Shimon kavita mutar letaltela kavita in lo kavita lo mai ta'ama. So we know that Rabbi Shimon says that once the candle goes out, you can move it. Why does he say only if the candle goes out? Mai ta'ama. What's the reason? Is it because when he moves the candle, if it's still lit, he might extinguish it? That's the concern. But Rabbi Shimon is the one who always says, Davar she'eino mitkaven. If you didn't intend to extinguish it, it's no problem. So if you drag a chair on the floor and it makes a hole in the ground, right? So you didn't intend to, so it's okay. So if I carry the candle and it goes out, I didn't intend to. So what's the problem? So the Tanya is within the Braita. Rabbi Shimon Omer Gorer Adam Kisev Umitav Safsalo Bilvat Shlo Yitkaven Lasot Charitz. Okay, so this is the same thing that we always bring up about Rabbi Shimon. As long as you didn't have intention to do it, it's no problem. So why can't I carry a lit candle and say, I don't intend for it to be extinguished? Kol echad ki mechaven ika isura deoraita. Kilo mechaven gazar Rabbi Shimon midrabanan. Kol echad ki mechaven ika isura derabanan. Kilo mechaven sharei Rabbi Shimon lechatechila. The answer is that first the Gemara answers like this. That maybe in a case where were you to have kavanah, were you to intend for it, it would be a biblical violation. There, even Rabbi Shimon would say you shouldn't risk it at all. But in a case where even with intention, it would only be a derabanan, such as if you drag a chair and it makes a hole in the ground. Even with intention, that would only be a nisur derabanan because you're not doing it in the normal way. You're doing it with a shinui. So therefore, he says you can do it as long as you don't intend for the result.
What do you mean by shinui?
You're doing it in an unusual way. It's not the normal way to pull. Is the normal way to dig in the ground, pull a chair? No, you dig with a shovel. So normally melachot have to be done in the normal way. The normal way with a shovel.
I think the digging is only when you pull the chair.
Right, but the point is that even if you dig a hole when you pull the chair, that's not the normal way of digging a hole.
No,
so it would only be a derabanan anyway. That's why he's letting you do it. What? They're asking why can't you? That's the question.
If you move it, the wind would put it there, that would not be normal either.
Right, true, but he's saying if you had kavanah for that, then it would be a deoraita. Okay, so here, maybe that's the reason why he doesn't let you move it. But they're going to reject that anyway, so hold on a second.
In this case,
Yeah.
why would these be
That's what Tosafot asked the question. It's the same problem. Really, even if you put out the candle, unless you needed the charcoal from the candle, it would be malacha she'ena tzricha l'gufa. Tosafot gives an answer there. No.
And remind me,
It's a problem.
What's the difference between shalom mitkaven and malacha she'ena tzricha l'gufa?
Shalom mitkaven is you didn't want the action at all. Malacha she'ena tzricha l'gufa is you wanted the action. You just didn't want the results. That's the malacha. It's like you cut the chicken's head off. You wanted to cut its head off. You just didn't want the chicken to be dead. You wanted to play with the head. You wanted to give it as a ball for the kids to play with. So you wanted to do shechita, you just didn't want the result of killing the animal. So that's inseparable. The two are inseparable. Right? That's malacha she'ena tzricha l'gufa. You did the action. I'm sorry, no, that's psik reshe. Right? Malacha she'ena tzricha l'gufa is where you did I'm giving you an example, but I'm changing the case, okay? The davar she'eno mitkaven is you did the action, you didn't intend for the result.
It has to do with your
Action and what?
You did one action, you didn't intend for a malacha at all. You didn't intend for a malacha at all. Malacha she'ena tzricha l'gufa is you wanted to extinguish the candle. You just didn't want the result of creating charcoal. You just wanted the light to go away. You wanted a negative. Okay, what I described as psik reshe. The one that they usually ask is what's the difference between psik reshe and malacha she'ena tzricha l'gufa? Because psik reshe is where you cut the chicken's head off, but you don't want you didn't want to kill the chicken. You just wanted the head. Okay, so that's psik reshe because you can't take the head of the chicken off without killing it. It's inseparable. So effectively, you wanted to kill it. Okay, whereas malacha she'ena tzricha l'gufa is no. I'm telling you, I want to do this malacha. I want to put out the fire. I just don't want charcoal. I want the fire to go away. You see, that's the difference. Now, it has to do with what you want. Now, Mativ Rava says this distinction in Rabbi Shimon is not a valid one. Because mochrek kesud mochrin kedarkan uvad shlo yitkaven b'chama b'nei chama u'b'gshamim b'nei gshamim v'atzinuin mafshilin b'makal la'achorehen. Okay, now we learned earlier that according to Rabbi Shimon, a person who's selling shatnez, clothing that's shatnez, he can model it for his customers. As long as he doesn't intend when it's hot to give himself shelter from the sun. And he doesn't intend when it's raining to protect himself. He's just modeling it. That's okay. And it says that Tznuim would put it on a makel. They would put it on a stick behind them rather than model it. But the point is, Rabbi Shimon is saying, even though were you to intend to wear the clothes for warmth or for protection, that would be a biblical violation of wearing the shatnez. And yet, he says, because you don't intend, it's okay. So he says, so you see that non-intention, even in a biblical violation, saves you. So you see that even that according to Rabbi Shimon, even if you're doing a bona fide biblical violation, if you don't intend for it, it's okay. And this is exactly our case. So if you carry the candle that's lit on Shabbat, even were you to assume that extinguishing it would be a deoraita, since you don't intend to, Rabbi Shimon should say it's fine. So Ela Amar Rava says, Hanach laner shemen uptila ho'il dena'asab basis ledevar ha'asur. What he says is that since the flame itself, Rava says, is not a kli, the flame itself is like etzim va'avanim. It's like wood or stones in the backyard. It's not a kli at all. The fire itself. The fire can't be moved. And what's supporting the fire? The wick and the oil. So since the wick and the oil are serving as a basis, they're serving as a support for the flame, and the flame itself is definitely muktzeh even according to Rabbi Shimon, because the flame itself is not a kli, it's not a tool, it's not something you can use on Shabbat for anything. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon will agree that that candle is muktzeh when the flame is lit, because the flame is the ikar, basically, the flame is the essential thing. Everything else is only supporting the flame as long as it's there. And the flame is not a kli. It's not something that has an alternate use on Shabbat either. You can't use it for anything on Shabbat. Besides, using a light. But you can't use it for any other purpose. So therefore, the fire itself is going to be muktzeh, and whatever's supporting it is going to be muktzeh according to Rabbi Shimon, even though in all other cases he's very lenient. Once the flame goes out, now you can move that stuff around and it'll be no problem.